All right. So we're going to go in. We'd love to hear who's in the room, or I guess read who's in the room. We'll talk a little bit about history and some indigenous understandings of gender, spend a little bit of time talking about research and data, and then strategies you can do to boost your own allyship for LGBTQ students of color. All right, so let's meet. In the chat, please share your name, your pronouns if you feel comfortable, what role you have, and which of the following photos best describes how you feel. Yeah, let me open up the chats and I will do the same. So. I'm going to change my answer from the morning session. Santana, thank you so much. Number 6, yes. Got the turtle. Number 3, oh, okay, Lily. The duck parent, yes. All right, feel free to keep it coming. Thank you, Adrian. 5 to 6, okay, I see that, I see that. Awesome, thanks so much for being here, for being part of this learning community. And I'm going to just exit for a minute. Judy, thank you so much. Don't mind my screen changing. I'm just bringing my mouse back. Okay, thanks so much. Appreciate y'all. So we're going to talk a little bit about some history and different cultural understandings of gender in different indigenous tribes. All of this to say, I'm not an expert, right? I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a sociologist. So I don't have indigenous roots. And it is important for me as an ally, as a person who works in LGBTQ queer and trans spaces, to uplift the knowledge that I do know. So if you are carrying a wealth of information, please share that, right? I will do my best to share my own understandings with you all and do some learning together. So our origins, meaning our origins as LGBTQ people, we have existed since the dawn of time. And that's important to name because I think right now we're in an era, in a time where language is new, right? We're hearing these new terms, non-binary, gender fluid, asexual, AFAB, right? All of these different terms that are part of the LGBTQ umbrella. And sometimes it can be easy to forget or to be like hyper-focused on this place, on here and now. And the modern LGBTQ movement might feel like it has a short history, right? And it's important for us to understand, and this is part of one of the goals for today, is that our history is just beyond this country that we know as America. It is beyond the 20th century. It is beyond the 21st century. Our history, starts when civilization started. And because of different forces of power and domination, we sometimes lose that perspective. And because additional language is being added like every single day, every month, we can forget that these efforts around language and around visibility and identity are sort of like an attempt to reclaim all of the things that we've lost throughout our history as people. And so all of that to say, we do have origins across the globe, particularly when it comes to different ways to relate to gender, gender norms, and gender identities, right? We might call them non-binary or third gender identities today, right now, using English, but obviously in different communities, cultures, tribes, there were different words that they used, different roles and definitions that they had. But we have documentation in the countries listed here and others beyond, and really on all parts of the globe. So here's a map from, and again, I'm going to escape because I lost my mouse and just make sure that the chat is open. Cool, just welcoming. Thank you so much, Anna. And I'll replay. So here is a map of different tribal communities and cultures that had a space or had roles for their own traditional gender identities outside of the binary we know. The binary we know in Western society, meaning man and woman, right? That's the binary that we're talking about, the gender binary. And so in these indigenous communities and cultures, they had spaces and roles for an additional option, sometimes multiple options, right? And what you see here are different words that were used in their traditional native languages to describe these figures or these positions in society. Now, while the definitions, how they looked, their roles in society differed, right? Overall, we can say that many of these societies, held up these roles and these people with a lot of esteem, a lot of respect, didn't discriminate or shun or shame or exclude people because of the ways in which they showed up in society. Often there was a role that was created specifically for them, whether they were a shaman type of person, whether they were sort of a spiritual advisor, community leader, right? We see those similarities. I'm curious if folks have heard of any of these terms. Feel free in the chat if any of these terms are terms that have been familiar to you or you have an understanding of. We'll talk about just a few of these more specifically, but wanted to give you sort of like the global sense of what we're talking about. So here are three specific examples of some of these groups on this slide. And the examples that we will talk about are mostly relegated to North America. So in the top left-hand corner, you'll see this is an example of Mahu people in native Hawaii. We will have the opportunity to watch a video to talk a little bit, that talks a little bit more about the role of Mahu people in native Hawaii culture. So stay tuned for that. In the bottom left, this is a photo of Hijras, who are people from the Hindu culture. We know that there are historical understandings of Hijra people so much, and it's so embedded and so strong in Hindu culture that now today in modern society, Hijra people actually have a legal standing, right? They have a specific legal recognition in countries in Southeast Asia, in particular India. And so their rooting in their culture and their understanding of their ancient traditions and customs has been so strong that they now have a legal place in society. For some of the other cultures that we see on the map, right, some of these roles and figures have been lost to history, right? All we have are maybe oral traditions of people who embodied these roles. But in some Hindu societies today, Hijra has a legal status and a legal standing. And then to the right is a photo of one individual whose name is Wiwa. They were a member of the Zuni tribe from New Mexico. And if we look back at the map, you'll see there on North America, there are several terms, and they were what's known as Lamana from New Mexico. And that was a specific term to describe sort of this third gender. And Wiwa has a more popular, like, cultural significance and understanding, right? In many cases, we don't know of actual individuals who held these roles. We just have an understanding of the role, the place in society. And Wiwa is actually an individual who we know about. We have a photo, we know their name, we know sort of a little bit of their history from the 19th century and the role that they played between Zuni tribes and Americans and the interface between the tribe and American Westerners. And so these are all groups of people that you can learn more about. You can take a screenshot of this and you can Google all of these different groups, right? I certainly don't know specifics about all of them, but knowing that these people existed and that there were words to describe their experience gives me a little bit of comfort, right? And also lets me know that this history has oftentimes been on purpose erased for forces that we'll talk about later on. Another group that I don't have a picture of, and I used to, and it must have just fallen off, but if you look in the country Mexico, in Mexico, there's a term there called muje. And muje is another traditional role that you can find in the communities of Oaxaca, in indigenous Oaxacan communities. And that role still exists today. And there's actually a resurgence of muje people who are celebrated. There's sort of community celebrations around their coming out and their role in society. And it's very, very beautiful. And you can do a little bit of research. There's a couple of like free documentaries on YouTube that you can watch about muje people. All right. And so we will watch a similar documentary. And let me share my computer sound. Okay, cool. And this is about the Mahu people. So we'll spend a couple minutes watching that.
Before the coming of foreigners to our islands, we Hawaiians lived in aloha, in harmony with the land and with one another. Every person had their role in society, whether male, female, or mahu. Those who embraced both the feminine and masculine traits that are embodied within each and every one of us. Mahu were valued and respected as caretakers, healers, and teachers of ancient traditions. We passed on sacred knowledge from one generation to the next through hula, chant, and other forms of wisdom. When American missionaries arrived in the 1800s, they were shocked and infuriated by these practices and did everything they could to abolish them. They condemned our hula and chant as immoral. They outlawed our language and they imposed their religious strictures across our lands. But we Hawaiians are a steadfast and resilient people. And so, despite 200 years of colonization and repression, we are still here. Kila kila o Maui nui a kama,
Kamalala valu aina okulu e aloha e pilani e.
Awesome. So that was a little bit about the Mahu people in Hawaii and the specific role they had in Hawaiian culture, right? And so when we talk about going beyond the binary, what we're talking about are societies and cultures that were organized in ways where every individual person had a specific role, regardless of what their gender expression might have been, right? No one was excluded. And what we see today in American and Western society is sort of the baseline is the binary, man or woman, and anybody else is othered, right? Is thought of secondary or tertiary, right? Is thought of afterwards. And a common thread that we see in indigenous cultures and amongst indigenous peoples is that folks weren't othered. They were integrated into society from the beginning. And if there's something that you take away, right, it would be that, like, how do we integrate all peoples into all societies from the beginning, and not just think of them, you know, after everyone else is already thought of. So, you know, these different relations and ways of looking at gender identity, their norms and their roles are diverse amongst all of these different indigenous peoples and cultures across the globe, right? They had different ways of relating to other expressions of gender. So a lot of these tribes didn't have contact with another, right? And so there's not one singular definition that we can use to describe this wide group of people. But as I said, overall, in many instances, folks within these roles were seen as healers, had certain strong roles within these different societies. One of the references that you saw in the video about Mahu was the impact of colonialism. In the case of Mahu, American folks who came on the shores of Hawaii and the role on culture. And so what happened was colonial forces and imperial forces used their power to basically destroy cultural practices that didn't fit with their own understanding of gender, of sexuality, of society, right? And that was influenced by racism, that was influenced by religion. Oftentimes you saw the reference to religion in the video with Mahu people. And so these legacies are really interconnected. And there are scholars today, queer and trans scholars, who really connect the dots between racism and homophobia and transphobia, right? You see folks who used fear of gender expansiveness. They use that fear and said, well, if you don't look a certain way, if you're a woman, like if you are hairy, right, or if you're a man and you're effeminate, they use those fears to intersect with race. It was done very much on purpose. So none of this is by accident. It is by design, right? They used these ideas to make people feel inferior, to make them feel like if you didn't look a certain way based on your gender, then that meant that you were a lower person, right? Then that meant that you were a person who wasn't civilized. And so these things were done in tandem. And that's another big takeaway from what we're talking about here is that racism, homophobia, imperialism, transphobia, colonialism are all intertwined. And so when we create spaces and try to address these issues, we have to do it together, right? We can't just say, well, this is only a space for racial issues, and we're not going to talk about the ways that gender norms and gender and machismo and patriarchy show up in this space. No, they have to be intertwined, because that's the way in which it was imposed on us and why we have society the way that it is today. Sometimes you'll see these narratives in media, particularly when we talk about the continent of Africa, right? And African countries, and how African countries, like LGBTQ people, aren't safe, right? We see LGBTQ refugees from all of these other countries. We like to point to these countries and say those people are homophobic and those people are transphobic. And the reality is that homophobia and transphobia are actually imported from colonial and imperial powers, right? It was part of this system to maintain control. And so with the example of the Mahu people in native Hawaii, they have been able to resist those narratives, so much so that now we see Mahu elevated, right? But some of these tribal communities were put in really horrible positions, right? Where they had this beautiful acceptance of these different gender roles. And when imperialists and colonists came, sometimes they were put in the position of having to choose between what they were going to keep and what they were going to hold on to. And so sometimes that meant that these tribes and the folks in power and tribes had to sort of push those people away, because missionaries were coming in and say, no, you can't have that in this society, right? And so there is documentation of that. And like I said back in the beginning, in some of those cultures, these roles and these positions and traditions are now lost. And in other cultures, they were able to maintain these roles, these respectful roles and cultural traditions, so much so that they're here today. And so I think about that, right? How much of this have we lost because of the influence of power? Another reality that I think is just important to know, where like I'm speaking English, I think most of us here are English speakers. Perhaps there are other languages that we also know and carry with us. For instance, Spanish, other Romance languages, right? Gender is everywhere. We use gender pronouns. And there are many non-Western languages that actually don't have a such thing as gender pronouns. And so this is another clue about like this binary not being as strong in other cultures. So an example, Tagalog does not have gender pronouns. Another language that does not have gender pronouns is Farsi. Farsi does not have gender pronouns. I'm sure if we had experts here around language sociology, right, they would be able to talk a little bit about how gender does or does not show up in languages, and how that is analogous to how important gender was or was not in certain societies and cultures. And so we are in the US today, we are using English today. So, you know, that's why we see all these terms pop up, all these different terms pop up, because we're trying to give language to ourselves in a culture that has tried to do a really good job of maintaining the binary. So shout out to, you know, the students and the generations after me and after many of us who are trying to bring back language and bring back more nuances into how we think about gender. But one attempt that we see that has sort of risen up is the term TwoSpirit. So TwoSpirit is an English term, and it is an attempt to try to embody like these different customs that we've learned about in different indigenous peoples. Obviously, indigenous peoples from centuries ago didn't use the term TwoSpirit. They used respectful terms in their own language, as you see here. But TwoSpirit today can be seen sort of as an umbrella term that we can use to describe this phenomenon that we see across different cultures and societies. What else do I want to say? You can go back to, I'll give you an example. Different cultures had different, gods, thought of creator in a different way, right? So an example might be Aztec people. They had many different gods for many different reasons. And so there is an example of a god amongst Aztec culture called Xochipilli, who today we might consider and use language like gay or homosexual to describe that person. But these are all examples of how fluid different cultures thought about gender and roles, and it wasn't as important to maintain this like binary hierarchy in their society. And so when we think about modern culture and modern history, particularly here in America and in North America, we still have strong instances that sometimes are elevated to the forefront in mainstream LGBTQ spaces. So what I mean by that, if you are a person who has spent a lot of time in LGBTQ spaces, you know LGBTQ history, you support LGBTQ students, there are go-tos that we think about all the time when we talk about LGBTQ history. Harvey Milk is a perfect example. Harvey Milk was the first openly LGBTQ official elected to office in California. We have examples like Christine Jorgensen, who was an early person in the middle of the 20th century who got gender affirmation surgery, right? All of these folks are like predominantly white people. And so the contributions and significance of people of color who are also LGBTQ don't really get as elevated, right? In LGBTQ spaces and in even cultural spaces. So here's a few examples that I'll talk with you about. First, we often don't see images from earlier centuries of LGBTQ folks of color. The top left is an image of two people who are playing around with gender. And this was actually an image from a popular postcard from, I believe, France or a country in Europe around the turn of the 20th century, right? And so this was an image that was really popular. We might say that maybe they're in drag, or perhaps one of those folks is a trans person, right? But these images exist, and we're often not shown them. On the bottom left, that is a headline from a news article and drawing that was actually done by a famous Mexican artist. His name was Posada. His last name was Posada. And this headline is talking about the baile, the dance of the 41, right? And so this was a story in Mexico at the turn of the 20th century, so 1901, as you can see here, where a group of 41 people were arrested in Mexico, mostly men, right, who were dressed differently. Some men were dressed like more masculine, and some men were dressed like in dresses, right? And who knows what sort of language they used to describe themselves. And that house party was raided because it was against the law to dress up as the opposite sort of gender in many, many societies, including in the US and Mexico. And so these folks were arrested for breaking the law. And the story goes is that there weren't actually 41 men there were actually 42. And the legend is that the 42nd person was actually the son-in-law of the president of Mexico at the time. And because he was the son-in-law of the president of Mexico, he sort of was able to not be arrested, so as not to bring on embarrassment or shame for the people in power, the presidential family in Mexico, because he was married to the president's daughter. And the implication of him being at that party was that he was gay. And so there are now more films, more blog posts, more information about instances like this, right? That don't center on just white people and aren't just in America or in other countries. In the middle, in the red, we have the Combahee River Collective. The Combahee River Collective was a Black feminist organizing group that operated in the mid-70s and really brought language to improving society. Social justice was an arm of the civil rights movement during the time of Black Power, right? And many of the members of the Combahee River Collective were lesbians. And so they brought that language to their social analysis of society and how patriarchy showed up in spaces and why it was important to elevate the realities of Black lesbians, of Black women, of Black feminists, right, in American society. And we see remnants of Combahee River Collective and what we now know as Black Lives Matter. So Patrisse Cullors, Opal, Alicia Garza, most of these women who founded Black Lives Matter are actually lesbians or identify as queer today, right? And some people don't know that or have that understanding because that's a part of their identity that they feel isn't central to the work, when in reality, it is absolutely a part of the work and has been since the beginning. And then two more examples that we see here. In the top right is a personal favorite of mine, Polly Murray. I first learned about Polly Murray, I want to say maybe 3 years ago. And there was a feature on them in the New Yorker about the many faces of Polly Murray. Polly Murray was a legal scholar, lawyer. At the end of their life had turned to the Episcopalian faith and became an Episcopalian priest. And this is the individual whose kind of like role in history has been lost to more dominant narratives. But in this New Yorker profile, it's made clear that throughout their adulthood, they really struggled with, their role in society. They were attracted to women, inhabited sort of a female body, but always felt like there was something missing. There's letters of them writing to doctors about wanting to have surgery or have hormones, right, for this missing part of them. So we might talk about them using language of today, right? Maybe they were transgender, maybe they were non-binary. Obviously, that language wasn't accessible to them. They had a really important role in the civil rights movement because they were a legal scholar. They were one of the first women to be in that profession. And one of their papers in school was all about the argument of segregation and why that was BS, right? And one of their professors remembered that argument and used that argument as the basis in the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education, right? And so that's history that a lot of us don't know and their role in that. And then finally, that news piece on the bottom right, that is a news piece about a formerly enslaved person who was arrested for having basically a drag ball, right? And so this new history of the first drag queen in the United States was a formerly enslaved person. And so all of these components are things that you can bring to LGBTQ spaces, to cultural spaces, to better reflect the history of LGBTQ students of color. Okay, so we'll talk briefly about research and data. And then Anna, how much time do I have left? Is it like 15 minutes, 20 minutes? Cool.
10 minutes.
So, awesome. So in 2019, GLSEN, which is a national organization that focuses on LGBTQ students in schools in educational settings, they put out 4 different reports that focused on LGBTQ students of color. So Black students, Latinx students, AAPI students, Asian American Pacific Islander, and Native and Indigenous students. So I will share those reports at the end of this if you don't have access to them. And I'm just going to highlight a few data points. So they talked about 2 in 5 LGBTQ students of color experience both homophobic, transphobic, anti-LGBTQ harassment and racist harassment, right? So these are the different layers of their identity just coming at once that perhaps white LGBTQ students might not face in the same ways. And this was across the board, no matter what racial or ethnic group you're talking about, 2 and 5. And this research was done nationwide. And of course, if you have any questions or have any comments, please feel free to, just pop it in the chat. So a couple things, 51, so more than half of Black LGBTQ students felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation, 40% gender expression, about a third because of their racial identity, right? And all of these things can happen simultaneously. Over to Latinx students, 41% of Latinx LGBTQ students experienced harassment or assault at school because of their sexual orientation and their racial ethnic identity. And there are any group, any data point related to safety, related to school discipline, related to remarks or bullying, you can find them all in the report laid out specifically by racial group. So overall, when a student is LGBTQ and has a non-white racial identity, they're more likely to experience harassment or violence at school, more likely to miss school, more likely to be homeless, attempt suicide, experience sexual abuse, right? All of these different behaviors because of the compounding layers of oppression based on their identity. So that's why we do this work. That's why we talk about it, right? Ideally, that's why you're here, right? To help move beyond some of these behaviors. So how can we boost our allyship, particularly with students of color in mind who are LGBTQ or in LGBTQ spaces? As you heard Dr. Malik Muhammad say, first things first, always be intersectional, right? Always think of the intersections. If you are an adult who is in LGBTQ spaces, how can you always be conscious of racial and ethnic diversity? Also other abilities, right? How can you include representation of deaf or hard of hearing folks with physical disabilities, right? In addition to racial and ethnic representation and history, so that those realities are also front and center. If you are an educator or an adult who hosts cultural spaces or racial spaces, how can you bring LGBTQ representation into those spaces? I get the privilege of having a team and an office in the city of Coachella. And Coachella is predominantly Latino, right? And so events like Dia de los Muertos, which is a Mexican and other Latin American cultures, uplift that event, right? It's a huge cultural event. So we make sure that we always include LGBTQ people as a part of the altars that are created for Dia de los Muertos, right? It's Black History Month, so how can you make sure you're elevating stories of people who are Black, who are LGBTQ, or movements within Black spaces that centered LGBTQ identity or talked about LGBTQ identity? So basically create a space for students to be their full selves. When a queer or trans student is coming into an LGBTQ space and they are Black or they are Native, they don't leave that at the door. They're also bringing that. So how can you make more space for them to talk about how those things intersect? This was a finding from that report that I talked about, and I'll share at the end. about Black LGBTQ students feeling safer and more connected when they had GSA and ethnic and cultural clubs, right? Understand some cultural terms. We talked about TwoSpirit. If anyone knows any other cultural terms related to LGBTQ identity, please feel free to pop that in the chat. Would be curious terms that you've heard. Other terms, the term stud is a very specific Black lesbian term, right? It's used to describe Black lesbians whose gender expression or presentation may be more masculine. A white counterpart to the term stud might be butch. But the term stud has a very particular usage within Black communities. And so understanding that, and if you were to hear white students or non-Black students use the term stud, right, really bring in the Black understanding of the importance of that term. We also see in some Black gay male communities that there might be a preference for using the term same gender loving as opposed to homosexual or a black gay man, right? These are all things that depend on region. Sometimes they depend on race, sometimes depend on generation as well. If you are an educator in a space where your students also speak other languages, right? How are you informing yourself about slang or possibly slurs related to the LGBTQ community in those languages, right? I'm thinking about Spanish, possibly Tagalog, right? Are you familiar with some of those slurs or slang terms that are used to refer to LGBTQ people in those languages? And how can you just be more aware in case they are being used? Understand some of these labels, and if there's the third thing that you can take away from today, understand the labels, but don't become beholden to them, right? Students are very fluid. In many of the societies that we talked about, there was fluidity in the way that they defined people, roles, and so we have to do the same thing for our students and reflect back at our students the words that they use for themselves. So if a student says that they're bisexual and maybe you see their behavior is not indicating that, we don't then say, well, actually you're this or you're this. Like, we reflect the terms that they use for themselves and let them tell us who they are, whether or not we agree with those terms. They're on their own journey, and so our job is to support wherever they might be in their journey. And related to the slide before, address all the phobias and all the isms that you can, right? Talk to your students, talk to your colleagues about the relationship between colonialism and racism and how that was intertwined with transphobia and homophobia and used to enforce really specific gender norms and gender roles. 7 minutes. Cool. Don't shy away from that. It's important for all of us to know that, regardless of what our racial or ethnic identity is, for white LGBTQ students to know that, for other students of color who are LGBTQ to know that these forces try to separate us, right? And so when we integrate that together, we can build stronger coalitions, have stronger movements that address all of these systems of oppression. The next one, ask students how their racial or ethnic identity or cultural practices might impact their LGBTQ identity. I'll give you the best example, right? I come from a Mexican background, Mexican culture. And in Mexican culture, in some families, events like a quinceañera are really, really important, right? For girls, Mexican girls. And so for an LGBTQ student who might be Mexican, who might be assigned female at birth, might be a girl, but maybe they're more, their gender expression is more masculine, right? How would a practice of quinceañeras impact them and their gender expression, right? I know I felt pressure to have a quinceañera, and ultimately I decided not to because I didn't want to wear like a big poofy dress, right? And have chambalans, right? And perform gender in this very specific way that wasn't who I was. And so sometimes that can impact my relationship to my racial or cultural identity in ways that make me feel like not enough, right? And so if you're aware of these cultural practices, then you can begin to have conversations of how does that impact your identity as an LGBTQ student or as a student who is questioning, right? And create more space to have some of those conversations. And then, continue what you're doing now. Y'all are here at the Equity Conference. I hope that there have been meaningful conversations or things that have been sparked for you. First things first, and Dr. Malik Muhammad said it at the beginning, know yourself and research your own cultural origins and how that society talked about gender, gave space to gender and sexuality, right? If you're a white person with origins in Irish communities or Norse communities, right? How did they treat gender? Did they have gods that had nuanced relationships to gender, right? Delve into your own personal history as a starting point. You can also look up some TwoSpirit organizations. You could research this photo. Where did this photo come from? Where was it taken, right? You could read about the 41, the dance of the 41 in Mexico. Learn more about Mahu people. Be really specific when you're looking up LGBTQ things and researching LGBTQ things. On Google or whatever research website that you use, insert different racial identities and see the different results that pop up, right? And always keep that in mind when you're looking up trans people, right? Look up trans Filipinos, look up trans Hawaiians, right? Never just let your exploration of LGBTQ identity only be LGBTQ, because what will happen is that will ensure that your results will mostly be white-centered and white-centric, because we live in a society where whiteness is elevated and deemed the majority and dominant. So be aware of that. And that's basically